Leader of the Opposition. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Now that a majority of senators have rejected the Prime Minister's company tax plan, will the Prime Minister advise Australians right here, right now, whether he will take his $65 billion tax giveaway to big business to the next election?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. As usual, the Leader of the Opposition is kicking off question time with a misleading statement. The Senate has not voted on the enterprise tax bill, and that's a minor detail of fact that the opposition doesn't seem to be able to come to grips with. But, Mr Speaker, the reality is very, very straightforward. The Leader of the Opposition knows, as he said in 2012, that any student of Australian business and economic history since the mid-1980s knows part of Australia's success was derived through the reduction in the company tax rate. And indeed, the member for Fenner, that economic wizard over there on the front bench, he said some years ago, 2011, we recognise in a world of mobile capital, capital is even fleeter of foot than the marathon runner opposite. With world of mobile capital, if we have high company tax rates, our companies will not get the investment they need to grow employment and boost wages. And of course, it was the Leader of the Opposition himself, in that much celebrated statement, which I'm sure he wishes he hadn't said, when he said back here, right where I'm standing, in 2011, cutting the company income tax rate increases productivity and investment. More capital means higher productivity and economic growth and leads to more jobs and higher wages. Mr Speaker, it's pretty straightforward. It was recognised by the honourable members opposite. I should not omit the honourable mention of the honourable member for McMahon, who wrote a book about it. He was so persuaded. Yeah, copies are available in good bookshops wherever remaindering occurs. Don't worry, you can get a copy. And Mr Speaker, they all knew that, they all recognised that, and now they're in economic denial. They want to pretend that companies' decisions to invest and employ have got nothing to do with the rate of taxation. Well, Mr Speaker, Australians are not so naive that they will be deluded by the Leader of the Opposition with his anti-business, anti-investment, anti-jobs campaign. He wants to hold back Australian business from making the investments, raising the productivity and creating more jobs. And that is why, Mr Speaker, we are committed to giving Australian companies and businesses a competitive company tax rate. They need that to compete, in order to create the jobs in Australia, to create the opportunities, and I might add, Mr Speaker, to generate the taxation revenues to pay for all the necessities that Australians need.
The member for Capricornia has the call. The member for Capricornia has the call. The microphone's on.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on the importance of policies that back business so that they can create more jobs for Australians and pay Australian workers higher wages, including in my electorate of Capricornia? Is the Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for a question. Mr Speaker, I'm comforted that my microphone is the only one that's on at the moment. Mr Speaker, the economy is powering because Australian businesses are creating a record number of jobs, 420,000 of them in the last 12 months. And if you want even more jobs, and that's our goal, should be all honourable members' goal, business needs policies that support investment. More investment means more jobs for Australians, and that's why our economic policies are backing businesses to invest more here in Australia. The alternative is doing nothing, or in the case of the opposition, raising taxes and sending Australian jobs and investment offshore. As the member for Fenner said, some years ago, capital is very mobile and it will go where it gets the best return. Why would we put lead in the saddlebags of Australian businesses in a competitive global environment where they want to get ahead, they want to invest, they want to employ? We need to make sure they have the energy to get ahead, the incentive to get ahead, while Labor, of course, wants to hold them back. And Mr Speaker, if the tax rate for businesses with a turnover over $50 million remains at 30%, we'll be holding those businesses back, holding them back from creating more jobs and higher wages. And Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition doesn't simply oppose lower taxes for all businesses, he wants to increase them. He wants to slug Australian workers, families and small business with more than $200 billion in higher taxes. That's the equivalent of $8,000 for every single Australian, $40,000 for a family of 5. That's what the opposition leader wants to put on the backs of Australian businesses and families. And the only result that will have is the destruction of jobs. And Mr Speaker, the reason he's doing that, he can't stop taxing because he can't stop spending. He wants to reach into the pockets of Australian workers and pay for his spending addiction. And Mr Speaker, he can't be trusted on any of these matters. He said his retiree tax only targeted millionaires. False. He then conceded, after repeated denials, that his tax wouldn't take money from pensioners and trustees, and now he's admitted that it will. He admitted it today. Yesterday, pensioners were let off, he said. Now he recognises, acknowledged that he's still hitting pensioners. And what about self-funded retirees? Mr Speaker, his pensioner guarantee was no more than a limited and 24-hour exemption. Australians can't trust a word the Leader of the Opposition says on their money.
Members on my right, the Leader of the Opposition has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to my previous question and the Prime Minister's public failure in question time to commit to taking his $65 billion corporate tax cut to the next election. We welcome an election on this issue, so I ask the Prime Minister again. Will the Prime Minister commit to taking his corporate tax giveaway to the next election? Yes or no?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, our commitment is to get the tax enterprise plan passed in this parliament. And I can assure the honourable member, that we are committed to it. We'll be committed to it today, and we'll be committed to it at the next election. And we welcome a contest with the Leader of the Opposition on tax. We welcome it. We welcome a contest on jobs, because that's what it's about. It's about creating jobs. It's about creating the incentives for jobs. And Mr Speaker, we know that every statement that the Leader of the Opposition has made about company tax will be used against him, and Australians will see what a turncoat he is. This is a man who stood up here and went on about company tax and creating more jobs. His partner there, the member for Lilly, he stood up and said it would add hundreds of millions of dollars to government revenues, a big productivity dividend. He said it would put $450 extra into the pockets of Australian workers. That was only a 1% cut in company tax. That's what the member for Lilly said. He said it standing here, just as the Leader of the Opposition said it standing here, just as Julia Gillard did, just as Paul Keating did. There was a time when the Labor Party recognised that lower business taxes result in more business. There was a time when they recognised that having an uncompetitively high company tax rate holds back Australian businesses. The member for Fenner made exactly that point. The member for McMahon wrote a book about it, and now they're all in denial. It's like some sort of Soviet era blanking out of the past. That's what they want to do. They want to pretend none of those statements were made. Well, they were, and Australians remember them, and they understand that. And they understand not only the economics, they understand not only the need to give businesses the opportunity to invest and employ, they understand that it means the Leader of the Opposition cannot be trusted. He has said one thing in government and now he says the exact opposite in opposition. He said lower company taxes encourage investment and higher wages in government, and now he says it's just a giveaway and will reduce the money available for hospitals and schools. What nonsense! Higher productivity, higher investment, more wages increases government revenues, just as the member for Lilly said in his budget paper in 2010. He did. He can't deny it, Mr Speaker. We've got it. We remember it all so well.
The member for Corangamite has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer explain why it is important for retirees to have access to tax refunds generated from the dividends they receive from the companies they have invested their savings in for their retirement? What are the risks of alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Corangamite for her question. And to respond, I think the best way is to give her an example of a constituent in her own electorate, Campbell. Now, Campbell's mother is 91. She lives in Corangamite. She owns shares. It's not a crime to own shares. She owns some shares. She's not on the pension, Mr Speaker. She uses the tax refund she gets from her share investments because of the tax that was already paid by the company. And she uses that tax refund that she gets from those share investments, she gets that and she pays her nursing home bills with that money, Mr Speaker. Even at the age of 91, Campbell's mum is looking after herself, she's paying her bills, she's used her investments to ensure that she has peace of mind in her retirement and that she has independence in her retirement. Now, that's why the government believes she should continue to get those tax refunds that she has put herself in a position to receive. Now, Labor think Campbell's mum is a tax cheat. Labor think Campbell's mum has never paid any tax in her life. Labor thinks that Campbell's mum is the problem, Mr Speaker. But I can tell you what, Labor's the problem, Mr Speaker. Labor is the problem because they don't get what Campbell's mum has done to put herself in a position where she can look after herself. And you know what's going to happen? Campbell's mum is going to have to ask
Treasurer, don't resume your seat. This won't take long. I'm not going to keep repeating myself on members who are being warned. I've warned the member for Burt. He's continued to interject following that warning. He can leave under 94A. And for all those others who've been in identical situations time after time again, consider yourselves warned. We're not going to put up with this wall of noise when the front bench on the opposition expect me to be listening to the answer as well as the questions when they're asked. The Treasurer has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. What is going to happen now is Campbell's mum is going to go to Campbell and say, I can't afford to pay those nursing home fees. Campbell, can you help me out? And Campbell will have to put his hand in his pocket to pay for the tax refund theft of the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker. That's what he's going to have to do. This is not just going to hit people like Campbell's mum, it's going to hit Campbell too, Mr Speaker. And you imagine how Campbell's mum is going to feel after she has done everything to ensure she can look after herself, and then she has to go to her son and say, can you help me out? They do not understand the dignity that they are insulting through this insulting retiree tax, the brainchild of the shadow treasurer, the prince of failures in the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government, Mr Speaker. This bloke hasn't got a clue. This policy has become a shambles, Mr Speaker, and every time he changes it, it gets worse on every occasion.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister. The leaked draft statement from the Business Council of Australia reveals that big business refused to commit to pay tax if the Senate passed the Prime Minister's $65 billion handout. When big business won't even commit to paying their tax, why is the Prime Minister so committed to giving big business $65 billion handouts?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'll remind the Leader of the Opposition
Member for Human Services and the Minister for Revenue and Financial Services will cease interjecting.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'll remind the Leader of the Opposition that paying tax is compulsory, and it would have been nice to have some help from the opposition with our multinational tax avoidance legislation. Mr Speaker, we won't take lectures from the Leader of the Opposition or his sidekick, the member for McMahon, on company tax payments. Let's face it, Labor had an opportunity to vote with us to pass the Combating Multinational Tax Avoidance Bill in 2015. Their only action on multinational tax was to not vote for that bill. They voted against it. What sort of consistency is that? We have implemented now, with no thanks to the opposition, some of the toughest anti-avoidance legislation in the world. In fact, the diverted profits tax, which builds on this legislation, is the most advanced multinational tax avoidance legislation in the OECD. And of course, it is having the results you expect. When you crack down on tax avoidance, you get less tax avoidance. That's precisely what we've done. Mr Speaker, the bottom line is our multinational tax avoidance law has allowed the Australian Taxation Office to identify 38 large companies that have brought or are bringing their sales to Australian customers onshore, where tax will be realised, in response to our tough new laws. And as a result, the expert advice from the ATO is that it expects an additional $7 billion in income each year will be returned to the Australian tax base. Now that's action on multinational tax avoidance. That's ensuring that everybody pays their fair share of tax. And it is remarkable when the opposition could have stood up and said, yes, we agree, we're all on a unity ticket, everyone should pay their fair share of tax. What did they do? They voted against it. It's yet another example of why Australians cannot trust the Leader of the Opposition. He stands up here and talks about companies paying tax and paying the right share of tax, and then when he had the opportunity to vote for those tough anti-avoidance laws which are delivering $7 billion a year to the corporate tax base in Australia, that was done by the government in the face of opposition from the Labor Party. They have no credibility on tax, no credibility on economics. They cannot be trusted with Australians' money.
Just before I call the member for Denison, I'd like to inform the House that we have present in the gallery this afternoon the Honourable Fred Chaney, a former senator and, more importantly, a former member of this House and a former minister. On behalf of the House, a warm welcome to you. The member for Denison.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, you'd be aware of my correspondence alerting you to Tasmania's housing crisis, especially in Hobart. I urged you to help remedy the situation. For instance, the Commonwealth public housing debt is costing Tasmania $15 million a year in interest payments and consuming a great chunk of the state's Commonwealth public housing assistance. Indeed, it's the biggest impediment to the Tasmanian government being able to significantly increase investment in public housing and give thousands of people a home. So, Prime Minister, will you axe Tasmania's housing debt to the Commonwealth, as was done for South Australia in 2013, and in doing so really help to do something about the housing crisis?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question and indeed for his letter. Our long-standing position is that housing loans provided to states must be repaid. That's the government's position. Housing is fundamental to the well-being of all Australians, and we're providing practical solutions across the entire spectrum of housing policy to address some of the issues raised in the honourable member's letter. The government's committed $570 million to unlock supply, encourage more investment in affordable rental housing and deliver additional homelessness funding. Through our investment, we're supporting Australians struggling to put a roof over their head by enabling older Australians looking to downsize their homes and put it into superannuation. we're assisting first home buyers save for a deposit through the First Home Super Saver Scheme, and that allows people, mostly young Australians, the ability to make voluntary contributions of up to $15,000 a year and $30,000 in total within their existing contribution caps to their superannuation account to go towards purchasing their first home. We've also tightened the rules that apply to foreign investors, so more homes are available for Australians, and we're better targeting tax concessions to ensure people are using them correctly. Overall, our comprehensive housing affordability package will make housing more affordable for Australians in all parts of the housing market to improve access to secure, stable and more affordable housing. Now, when the Coalition came to government in the federal parliament in 2013, Tasmania had an unemployment rate with an 8 in front of it. It now has a 6 in front of it. Over this period, 16,400 more Tasmanians are in work, and those precise figures are a reduction from 8.1% unemployment in September 2013, the honourable member's state, to 6.0% in February this year. Now, our sole focus is on providing a strong economy so that more Australians have the chance to gain employment and secure their futures. City deals in Launceston and Hobart, investment in infrastructure and projects like the new Antarctic icebreaker are all about making sure the honourable member's state is a great place in which to live, work and invest.
The member for Swan.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer explain why it is important to reward aspiration, encourage Australians to have a go in our economy, and what are the risks of alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Swan for his question. People who know about aspiration and having a go are small businesses, and the member for Swan knows all about running small businesses and supporting investors in small businesses and about people having a go, Mr Speaker. And it's a shame that the member for Cowan is not more like the member for Swan when it comes to understanding small business, because in the member for Cowan's electorate, Mr Speaker, in the member for Cowan's electorate, Cowan is a small business owner, and he is a member. He is in the member for Cowan's electorate. He does not have a member of parliament who understands the pressures faced by small business. He's not a retiree. He relies on the tax refund he gets from the shares that he bought to give him an income when his business is not seeing great days. Because small businesses like the member for Swan understand that some years you have good years and some years you have bad years. And small businessmen, they go out there, small businesswomen, they buy shares, they get the tax refunds from those when the business is going through lean years, and that is their income. What those opposite don't understand is that the profit of a small business is the small business owner's wage. That's what they live on. And some years they don't make a profit, and in those years they rely on the investments they've put into shares and the tax refund, which is theirs, not the government's, it's theirs, it's owed to them, they've made the investment. And, Mr Speaker, members opposite simply don't get this. They don't get small business, they don't understand that what they have done with this clueless and gutless tax on retirees, and not just retirees, as I've just demonstrated with Cowan, a small business owner in the member for Cowan's electorate. What they don't understand is that people make investments so they can support themselves and their families.
The member for
and
Cowan
what the
is
Leader of the
warned.
Opposition has done, together with his clueless shadow treasurer, is just gone in there and stomped all over their income, picked it all up, put it in their pockets, and off they've run, Mr Speaker. This shadow treasurer is clueless when it comes to understanding small business. As we know, he's the shadow minister for small business, and now he is the shadow minister for making business smaller and making their profits smaller and making their wages smaller, because this shadow treasurer cannot be trusted with the best interests of small business, of retirees, of pensioners and any other Australian who is decently out there trying to earn a living.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. A leaked draft of the statement from the Business Council reveals that big business refused to commit to, and I quote, increase wages if the Senate passed the Prime Minister's $65 billion handout. When big business won't commit to increase wages, why is the Prime Minister so committed to giving big business a $65 billion handout?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, to quote one of the honourable member's heroines, Julia Gillard, right here, she said, 2012, Julia Gillard, Prime Minister, said, "If you are against cutting company tax, you are against economic growth." That's what she said. If you are against economic growth, then you are against jobs. That's right. And what about the elder statesman, Paul Keating, at his policy launch in 1993? He said, "We lowered the company tax rate from 39% to 33%. That was a lot, 6%. Providing Australian industry with a business tax system competitive with any in the world. This is where the energy will come from, and we will do everything we can to stimulate it and, where necessary, provide strategic support." Now, Mr Speaker, when Paul Keating said that, when Julia Gillard said that, when the Leader of the Opposition and the member for McMahon and the member for Lily Fenner, all of them said the same thing. They weren't relying on the altruism of company directors any more than we are. We rely on the economic logic that has prevailed through both sides of politics until very recently, that if you increase the incentives for business to invest, then they will invest more. If they invest more, as the Leader of the Opposition said on one occasion, you get higher productivity, more jobs and higher wages. It's pretty obvious. So I'd leave the honourable member opposite just to reflect on the wisdom of her heroine, Julia Gillard. If you're against cutting company tax, you're against economic growth. If you're against economic growth, then you're against jobs. So it follows that the member for Sydney and her leader and all her colleagues there are against economic growth and against jobs. I'll tell you, the government is for economic growth and it is for jobs, more jobs and better paid jobs.
The member for Dawson.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure and Transport. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on recent regional infrastructure announcements that are creating local jobs in rural and regional Queensland, including in central and North Queensland?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Dawson for his question and thank him also for his advocacy for central and northern Queensland. Mr Speaker, I visited the electorate of Dawson on the 8th of March to announce an important project. It was the Horton River floodplain project upgrade, and the contract was announced today, Mr Speaker. And we've committed $411.4 million to this project. It includes 13.5 kilometres of Bruce Highway near Garoo in the Burdekin. Mr Speaker, a new Horton River Bridge, 2 cane rail overpasses, Mr Speaker, 9 rural intersections. Mr Speaker, more than just being part of the $6.7 billion Bruce Highway upgrade, this is going to save lives. This is going to save lives. And I'm asked about jobs. 544 jobs will be created from this particular project. Contractors have been asked to demonstrate their commitment to engaging local employees and businesses, which is good news for the Burdekin. The Horton River Bridge will be built to withstand a 1-in-100-year flood. Mr Speaker, this project will increase safety for families, for truckies and for the many visitors who go to that fine region. Mr Speaker, I was with Craig Lowndes today, a great sportsman, as well as Russell White, road safety advocate, launching a road safety and fatality-free Friday initiative. Mr Speaker, the government has also announced $32.9 million worth of additional spending to 144 black spot projects, Mr Speaker, half of which are going to be in regional areas. Mr Speaker, the members for Gilmore, for Hinkler and Wide Bay were there at the launch. This is delivering infrastructure that Australia wants, needs, demands and expects, Mr Speaker. But I'm asked about alternatives. And Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition, I have to say, is a man conflicted. Should he back workers or should he back his union mates? Should he back coal miners in regional Queensland in the member for Dawson seat, Mr Speaker, or should he vote for inner-city Greens, Mr Speaker, with what he says and what he does? Should he back tax cuts, Mr Speaker? He used to believe in tax cuts, Mr Speaker, or will he throw out sound economics, Mr Speaker, and damage people's hopes for a job, for a future? Should he raid the nest eggs of thousands of pensioners and retirees, Mr Speaker, or will he backflip on that too, Mr Speaker? The Australian people, Mr Speaker, know this man cannot be trusted, not with the truth, not with his words, not with his actions, not with people's pensions, Mr Speaker, not with people's monies. Not with money, not with the economy, Mr Speaker, and certainly not with the jobs of our children and our grandchildren. Whether they're in the member for Dawson's electorate, Mr Speaker, wherever they might happen to be, Mr Speaker, people will always pay more. People will always pay more under Labor. We know that, Mr Speaker. The member for Maribyrnong said that he believed in jobs when he was in opposition, Mr Speaker. Now, when he was in government, he doesn't say it when he's in opposition, Mr Speaker. Don't believe what this member of the opposition says, Mr Speaker. Believe what he does.
Has concluded. The member for Gorton.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister. A leaked draft of the statement from the Business Council of Australia reveals that big business refused to commit to, and I quote, create more Australian jobs if the Senate passed the Prime Minister's $65 billion handout. When big business won't commit to create more Australian jobs, why is the Prime Minister so committed to giving big business a $65 billion tax handout?
The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, the standing orders require that if a question has been fully answered, it can't be renewed. And the question that the member for O'Connor has just asked—
The Leader of the House will pause. Members will cease interjecting. They've obviously got very poor memories. I've been reluctant to throw members out. I've been reasonable, I think, but if they want me to set a record, I'm happy to. The Leader of the House will begin his point of order again.
Mr Speaker, the standing orders require that a question fully answered can't be renewed, and the Deputy Leader of the Opposition's question was almost exactly the same.
I'll just stop you there. I'll stop you there. I'll stop you there. The problem is almost, and you're right, and it needs to be identical, and it's not. The Prime Minister has— No. Leader of the House, I can take you to the page of the practice if you'd like to, but it is a very, very clear— No, there's more than one word different, and it's very clear. In fact, I could even take him— I've got a very good memory— to precedents where he was on the other side arguing against just the point of order he made. The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The coalition government, the Liberal and National parties, are backing businesses to create more jobs and to support higher wages. That's what our policies are about. That's what we're doing. We've always believed that, Mr Speaker, and we've always acted consistent with our beliefs that by backing in people in business, from small businesses to large businesses, they are the engines of growth in our economy. That's where higher wages come from. That's where investment comes from. That's where jobs comes from. And that's why, as a government, as Liberal and National parties, we have been committed to follow through on our convictions and our beliefs to ensure we do the right thing for the Australian economy so jobs can be created. And jobs have been created, Mr Speaker. 420,000 jobs have been created only in the last 12 months. We're only a few thousand jobs shy of the million jobs, the 1 million jobs that we promised would be created under a coalition government when we came to office in 2013, and we are close to hitting that mark 6 months 6 months in advance of the promised period, Mr Speaker. So we're sticking to our credentials, we're sticking to our commitments, we're sticking to our beliefs. But the Labor Party, the Shadow Treasurer, the Leader of the Opposition and all the others over there, Mr Speaker, they used to believe in these things. They used to write books about these things. They might even write songs about them, Mr Speaker. I've got no idea, but I do know that they used to believe them, and when they're asked to vote for them, they scurry off like rats from a shit, Mr Speaker. They scurry off, and this is the problem with Labor. They used to believe this because they used to listen to people that made sense on economic policy. So who are they listening to now? Who are they listening to now? And what other ideas do those people who they're listening to have about taxes in our economy? They're listening to Get Up. They're listening to the Australia Institute, that great middle-income champion of Australia, Mr Speaker. It's not a left-wing think tank. Not at all, Mr Speaker. Of course it is. And what's their views? They take much advice from the Grattan Institute. Here are some policies from those that the Labor Party are listening to. Put the family home in the assets test for the pension. Death duties, Mr Speaker. Death duties, Mr Speaker, is what they listen to propose, Mr Speaker. Scrapping the capital gains tax discount, Mr Speaker. Putting capital gains tax on the family home. Putting a tax on business for the fuel they use, Mr Speaker. These are the taxes that have been whispered into the ear of the Shadow Treasurer, and he has demonstrated he has a great capacity to take up numpty ideas.
The member for Page.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister update the House on the importance of well-designed border protection policies, and is the minister aware of any alternative approaches to policy making?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member very much for his question. And as the Australian public knows, it's taken us a number of years, but we have tried our best to clean up Labor's mess in the border protection area. They allowed 50,000 people in on 800 boats, and tragically, Mr Speaker, 1,200 people drowned at sea. Now, it's interesting to have a look, Mr Speaker, at who the architect was behind the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd years disaster on border protection policy. Everyone in this House knows, and the Australian public needs to know, that the man who wants to be the Treasurer in a Shorten government, if Mr Shorten's to be elected leader at the next election, he is the person who was Immigration Minister, as it turned out, in the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd years. And under the member for McMahon's reign, we know that 25,000 people arrived on 400 boats. Now, he's the man who wants to be the next Treasurer. He's designed this tax that we've just seen go down in a heap in the last 24 hours, where he proposed to whack a tax on 300,000 pensioners, and who would have believed he presided over another mess. Now, Mr Speaker, this guy, the member for McMahon, it's interesting to have a look at his background, because he was also a Treasurer in the glorious periods of the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd years. He was one of Australia's worst Treasurers, one of Australia's worst periods in government in this country, Mr Speaker. And do you know, Mr Speaker, it was a glorious reign, a short reign, but glorious nonetheless, Mr Speaker. Now, he believes that he is the next Paul Keating, Mr Speaker. I don't know, is that a Xenia suit you're wearing? It's not an expensive suit, Mr Speaker, I don't think.
I'm just going to say to the Minister—
Yes, Mr Speaker.
If he asks questions, I may well let the member answer.
Well, let me pose this question, Mr Speaker. I mean, does he have any antique clocks at home? Does he have any dodgy investments in piggeries, Mr Speaker? These would be important questions, because, as it turns out, this poor man's Keating across here, the only thing he has done in terms of walking in the footsteps of Paul Keating in '92 set up mandatory detention, immigration detention in this country. The member for McMahon, when he was the Minister for Immigration, increased the number of detention centres by 6. He put into detention 4,000 children. And, Mr Speaker, he has been a failed member of the Labor Party at every turn. And the Australian public should be reminded that it's not only the Leader of the Opposition that has a dodgy track record, both as a member of parliament and as the union boss in this country. The member for McMahon was a failure in the Labor government, and he would be a disaster if ever he was to occupy the crossbenches in this place.
Member for McMahon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The leaked draft statement from the Business Council reveals that big business refused to commit to increased wages when the conditions are right. When big business won't even commit to increasing wages, quote, when the conditions are right, why is the Prime Minister so committed to giving big business a $65 billion tax cut?
The Prime Minister has the call.
I quoted the member for Sydney's heroine Julia Gillard on this subject when she said, if you're against cutting company tax, you're against economic growth, and if you're against economic growth, you're against jobs. And she obviously, well, we know she is a great admirer, as is the member for McMahon, of the former Labor Prime Minister Paul Keating, very distinguished treasurer. And of course, his experience was, after many years in that job, that lowering company tax, as he did very substantially, resulted in more investment, higher productivity, more jobs and higher wages. And that was the consistent experience. But there was one other great saying of Paul Keating that the honourable member for McMahon would remember, and that is that in the great race of life you should always back self-interest because it's trying. And the reality is the reason businesses invest more and employ more and pay higher wages when there's more economic growth is because they want to make a profit. In other words, you give business the incentive to get ahead, you give business the ability to be competitive, and then it will get going and do so. And Paul Keating could see that, Julia Gillard could see that. There were days when the member for McMahon could see it, but it's all got a bit cloudy now in the rear vision mirror. He can't recall that much-admired book up there being remaindered away, and neither can the Leader of the Opposition recall what he said in the House. The member for Lilly has entirely obliterated from his memory the 2010 budget, although there are other compassionate reasons to do that, so we shouldn't perhaps go on too much about it. The bottom line is very clear. You give business the incentive to get ahead, and they will do so and hire and invest. We want Australian businesses to get ahead and compete and win. That's why we back free trade deals, whereas Labor opposed them. Remember the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Leader of the Opposition said it was all dead, it was a vanity project. Do you know what? There are thousands of jobs in Australia will be created by Australian businesses because of that free trade agreement, just as there has been by other free trade agreements that we succeeded in negotiating. And we know right now thousands of jobs, in fact over 1,100 a day, are being created in Australia in large measure because of the enthusiasm of Australian small and medium family businesses who've had the encouragement of our corporate tax cuts so far. We want that right across the economy, more economic growth, more jobs. The Labor Party has forgotten economics.
The member for Barara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Jobs and Innovation. Will the Minister explain why it's important to be consistent in designing and implementing policy that impacts on the lives and aspirations of Australians? Are there any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Barara for his question. And it's a very important question because obviously a consistent approach to thinking about and implementing policy has a dramatic impact on what governments do in the lives of Australians, particularly in the economy. And it's been that consistent approach to policy development in the Abbott and now Turnbull governments that has led to us being very close to achieving the 1 million new jobs that we promised in 2013 when the government was first elected. We are only months away from hitting that figure, and in the last 12 months it's been 420,000 Australians have benefited from a consistent and methodical approach to policy, Mr Speaker. So we are getting the job done. And I'm asked about consistent approaches to policy. What we see on the other side of the House, Mr Speaker, is a completely shambolic approach to policy making. And this week, the Labor Party announced a guarantee for pensioners, a pensioners' guarantee policy, a guarantee to save them from the Leader of the Opposition himself, Mr Speaker. That is the guarantee, to protect them from the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker. But why would anybody believe that any policy held by the Leader of the Opposition would last very long in opposition, let alone in government? Because this man's career has been punctuated by consistent flip-flop approaches to policy, punctuated by completely doing a U-turn to suit his own expedient political ends. This year we've seen the debate about the Carmichael mine. He told Pauline Hanson, Senator Hanson, that he was the most pro-coal leader of the Labor Party, the most pro-coal person in the Labor opposition, while he also told Jeff Cousins that he would block the Carmichael mine in North Queensland. So he said in North Queensland to coal workers that he was pro the Adani mine, and in Melbourne he told the people of Batman that he was against the Adani mine. On the company tax cuts, Mr Speaker, he told the ACOS conference in 2011 that company tax cuts grew the economy, increased wages, increased profits and jobs, Mr Speaker. And now we hear this Corbyn-esque claptrap from the Leader of the Opposition about what company tax cuts would do. But he was pinged, Mr Speaker, in Paul Kelly's book, because his greatest duplicity is saved for his internal Labor Party dynamics. In the Paul Kelly book, Mr Speaker, he quoted, I quote, "The distrust between Rudd and Shorten was intense and enduring. The Gillard camp was contemptuous of Shorten, considering him weak and duplicitous. Neither side trusted him and neither side revised its view." That has been the hallmark of the Leader of the Opposition's approach to life, to politics, to the union. That's why he can't be trusted, and the Australian people know that, and they don't trust him.
The member for Franklin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The leaked draft statement from the Business Council reveals that big business refused to commit to, and I quote, "create more Australian jobs in the cities, suburbs, towns and bush." When big business won't commit to create more jobs in the cities, suburbs, towns and bush, why is the Prime Minister so committed to giving big business a $65 billion tax handout?
The Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, the member must be completely unaware of the statements by Alan Joyce, the CEO of Qantas, Rob Scott, the CEO of Wesfarmers, Russell Zimmerman from the Australian Retailers Association, Peter Coleman, the CEO of Woodside, Alison Watkins, the Managing Director of Coca-Cola Amatil, just some of the very large companies that employ tens, hundreds of thousands of Australians, Mr Speaker, who have committed, who have been out there making it very clear that this very simple principle that if you make business not pay as much money to the government, they're in a much better position to give workers a pay rise. And the Labor Party is standing between workers in this country and a pay rise because they think businesses should pay the government more than pay their employees more, Mr Speaker. That's what Labor thinks. They think that the best way to increase wages in this country is to make businesses pay the government more. And the member for Fenner this week actually put out research that he says he did himself, which shows that if you put higher taxes on business, you get higher wages, you get higher economic growth. Well, let's put it up to 35. Let's put it up to 40. Why not 45? The Labor Party believe the higher you tax the economy, the better the economy goes. Now, what sort of morons must they be listening to think that this is good economic policy, Mr Speaker? Look, I think the Leader of the Opposition, and in particular the Shadow Treasurer, have somehow departed from the common sense they once understood earlier in their lives, Mr Speaker. I mean, we saw most recently in the article in the Australian, the Shadow Treasurer was profiled, and there he was in that pensive look in front of his voluminous bookcase with the hand on the chin, looking up there, and he said, "Oh, my own one great regret was when I was at university, getting all those high distinctions," he happened to mention. Very, very modest of him. "I just wish I'd gone out and partied more. I wish I'd partied more, Mr. Well, you must have been partying for the last 3 years, Mr. Speaker, the Shadow Treasurer, because he hasn't come up with a good idea in that entire time. He's been sitting around posing for photos, Mr. Speaker. I love this one.
The Treasurer knows the rule on props.
How good's that?
The Treasurer will resume his seat. Treasurer will resume his seat. Treasurer will resume his seat. The member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Revenue and Financial Services. Will the Minister update the House on the importance of ensuring taxation policies are sensible and well designed? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches that pose a threat to the prosperity of hard-working Australians, including in my electorate of Grey?
The Minister for Revenue and Financial Services.
I thank the member for Grey, and I note how hard he is at working and advocating for his constituents. And of course, he recognises, as does the government, that we need to protect the prosperity of Australians and that every policy that we pursue should be aimed at protecting that prosperity. And of course, a very crucial part of that is to design sensible policies that alleviate the tax burdens that act as a handbrake on our economy. This government has cut taxes for small and medium-sized enterprises, and we have relieved the tax burden on middle-income Australians, 3 million of whom will not pay higher taxes as a result of our increase in the tax threshold. And we remain committed, of course, to doing even more for those people. But the contrast with those opposite could not be clearer. They have proudly announced their intention to take a $200 billion tax sledgehammer to the incomes and the livelihoods and prosperity of millions of Australians, and that will directly impact on our economy. Not only are they doing that, but they are doing it in a completely unfair and illogical way. Take their retiree tax 1.0. Originally announced and lauded by the Shadow Treasurer as being carefully designed, despite the fact that it robbed hundreds of thousands of pensioners from their tax refunds. Now, of course, they have relaunched it to be Retiree Tax 2.0, and again have fallen over each other to say how carefully designed it is and how progressive it is. Now, as was the case first time round, it's all spin and no substance. It will punish those people who are on middle and lower incomes, because under their policy, someone on a $500,000 a year salary who also receives hundreds of thousands of dollars of franking credits, they wouldn't be impacted. Not at all. The total benefit of their tax already paid will offset their tax liability. But of course, what of an elderly self-funded retiree with $18,000 in taxable income a year, including $2,300 in dividends, who has paid tax all their life? The Labor Party, under their policy, will pocket their $700 tax refund. Their policy does not make sense. Their policy will affect 875,000 retirees, wage earners and even pensioners who dare to put their money into self-managed super funds from tomorrow onwards. Their Retiree Tax 2.0 is no better than 1.0. It's like putting mag wheels, a spoiler and a speed stripe on a Hyundai Excel. It's no good. Australians know it, and they know they can't trust this Leader of the Opposition with their money.
The member for Rankin. Members on both sides. The member for Rankin has the call.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The leaked draft statement from the Business Council reveals that big business wouldn't even commit to, quote, increase wages when the conditions are right, end quote. Given that over the last 2 years wages have grown by only 4%, while company profits have increased by 32%, has the Prime Minister had any discussions with big business about just how much more profit they need before they'll give a fair share to their workers.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The honourable member knows very well when he put this question to me, or question along the same lines earlier in the week, that the fact is that over the last year we've seen company profits and wages rise by approximately the same amount. Over the last 6 years, wages have risen considerably more than company profits. The figure he's using is one that has been cherry-picked to take advantage of a spike in earnings because of the commodity boom. The honourable member's an economist. He understands the principles that were put in the 2010 budget papers. He understands them very well. He knows very well the Treasury analysis that in 2010 said that a 1% cut in company tax would add 0.4% to GDP. The honourable member can interject as much as he likes, but the reality is that the same Treasury analysis that advised his boss, the member for Lilly, Treasurer at the time, that it would add $450 into the pockets of Australian workers, have given the same analysis, says that the company tax plan we're taking through to the Senate will deliver $750 into Australian workers' pockets. It's exactly the same analysis, probably by the same analysts. So there was a time when the Labor Party understood and adhered to economic orthodoxy. It's all thrown away in this chase after pensioners and self-funded retirees' savings. And Mr Speaker, just to give the honourable members opposite the latest dispatch from their latest class war, I'd remind them of what Margaret Sykes, a lady in her 70s, said to me this morning. She said, "My husband worked 5 jobs as a young man to make sure we were self-reliant when we were older. He died in 2010, still working, but said before he died he worked so hard to make sure I was looked after. I'm a self-funded retiree. I have shares to supplement my income. I'm not one of Bill Shorten's millionaires. I don't go on holidays or smoke, drink or dine out. Just a person who is not dependent on Centrelink." Margaret Sykes. They're the people the Labor Party is after.
The member for Fisher.
My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the minister outline to the House how the government's record investment in new medicines is underpinned by a strong economy, and is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Fisher, who's been a great advocate since coming to this place, not just for new medicines but also for investment in mental health and, in particular, recognising the scourge of eating disorders. So he's advocated health expenditure, but he understands that it comes fundamentally from the ability to manage the economy, as we see with the creation of over 400,000 jobs in the last year, of over 1,100 jobs a day on average. Those things are good in and of themselves, but they also underpin social expenditure, social investment and, in particular, investment in health. It's only through a strong economy that you can support the health system. And that means that we are able to do things such as list $8.2 billion worth of new drugs since coming to office, life-saving drugs and life-improving drugs. On the 1st of April, another 11 new drugs coming on board, in particular in areas such as diabetes, where the drug Toujeo will help over 170,000 Australians reduce the risk of hypoglycemia, reduce the risk of having a hypo in the middle of the night, which for parents and for sufferers is fundamentally important. Drugs for lung cancer, drugs which would otherwise have cost up to $99,000 a year will now be available on the PBS, for basal cell carcinoma, for lymphoma, for severe asthma and also for rheumatoid arthritis. And on that front, I actually received a letter this week from Casey Gardner of Brisbane, a 35-year-old mum, who wrote that, quote, I'm one of the 2,000 or so Australian patients that will benefit from pre-filled methotrexate syringes being added to the PBS. And this is for rheumatoid arthritis. She goes on to say that this listing means I can spend more time doing what I love, on what matters to me, to be with my husband and my daughter. The PBS has made this possible, and again, I just wanted to express my gratitude. Imagine, however, the alternative of being a party, and I mean the Labor Party, which deliberately deferred drug listings. They deliberately deferred drug listings. And look at every member of their front bench who was on the front bench of the previous government, and they deferred drug listings for severe asthma. The very thing that we're listing, they deferred drug listings for asthma.
The member for Ballarat
they deferred drug listings for pulmonary conditions and for schizophrenia. What a bunch of people these are that would pretend that they care about health. What a no, seriously, these are people with an utter disrespect for the Australian public when they cut medicines that are fundamental for mental health, for severe asthma and pulmonary conditions. Two different approaches.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. We now know that big business has refused to commit to create Australian jobs, increase wages, avoid offshoring, invest in remote and rural Australia, or my favourite, even pay tax. Why is the Prime Minister so committed to his $65 billion giveaway to big business when big business won't commit anything in return to him?
The Prime Minister has the call.
I know. Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, as I said to the House earlier in this question time, we don't rely on the altruism of company directors in framing taxation policy. We rely on economics. In fact, Economics 101, something that seems to have been forgotten by the Labor Party. Business will respond rationally and will invest more, where the incentives are to invest, will employ more, and because you get stronger economic growth, you get more jobs. And as Julia Gillard said, the heroine of honourable members opposite, if you're against lowering company taxes, you're against economic growth, and if you're against economic growth, you're against jobs. But one thing the Labor Party is really against is self-funded retirees and Australians who invest in those companies that they need to have strongly growing so that they can pay dividends to them. Our self-funded retirees generally invest in Australian companies because they're benefiting from the strong economic growth. But I want to give the honourable member opposite another dispatch from the front line of his class war, from another self-funded retiree, Stuart, who's in his 70s. He's in retirement. He has about $450,000 in his self-managed superannuation fund. He's in the retirement stage. It's less than $1.6 million, so it's not liable to the 15% tax. He gets annual dividends, fully grossed up, of about $34,000, of which $9,000 is the franking credit. Now, they hate you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Labor Party hate Australians that save. They hate Australians that work hard and save. Look, I was sneering.
The member for Shortland. The Prime Minister will pause. The Prime Minister is going to tell whatever he thinks he is to the member for Shortland as the member for Shortland leaves under 94A. I can't make it any clearer. He's interjected repeatedly. He's warned, and he even acknowledges being warned and then interjects within 10 seconds. He's unhelpable. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And one thing, all of those self-funded retirees I was with this morning with Senator Zalja, all of them said one thing they all knew and all agreed on, that all of those Labor members that are going after their savings will have much more in superannuation and much better pensions than any of them will have. But, Mr. Speaker, let me return to Stuart. He has $34,000 coming in for his dividends. His fund does not pay tax. It's in the retirement stage. 9,000 of that is franking credits. The Labor Party wants to take that off him. They want to take that off him, but if he had $34,000 in rent or an interest, he'd keep the lot. So how crazy is that? What is this? Penalising older Australians for investing in Australian companies.
Has concluded. The member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Minister for the Environment and Energy. Will the Minister update the House on how the government is creating a more affordable and reliable energy system that is so important to pensioners and those with low incomes, including in my home state of Victoria? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Chisholm for her question. I know she's concerned about high power prices, the impact it's having on household budgets and particularly the most vulnerable, including Jennifer, a pensioner in Burwood, who, like thousands across the electorate, is struggling with her power bills. Indeed, in a recent survey in Victoria, it was found that 3 out of 4 households are making financial sacrifices to meet their power bills, and 1 in every 4 households in Victoria are now cutting back on their grocery bills merely to meet their power bills, Mr Speaker. Now, that is why the Turnbull Coalition government has taken action to deliver a more affordable and reliable power system, and I'm pleased that both Alinta and Powershop have recently reduced their power prices in Victoria, and the work we've done with the retailers to get a better deal for thousands of Australians, the work that we've done with the networks to stop the gaming of the system under the Limited Merits Review, our intervention in the gas market, which the ACCC has said has seen a significant fall in the gas price, and of course the National Energy Guarantee, a recommendation by the independent experts that independent modelling shows will leave the average Australian household $300 a year better off than under the Labor Party's plan, Mr Speaker. And I'm asked, are there any alternative approaches? Well, we know what happened when the Labor Party was last in office. Electricity prices doubled, Mr Speaker. We had the carbon tax. We had the Citizens' Assembly, and we had the cash for clunkers, Mr Speaker. And that sheer incompetence will be returned if Labor got any chance to sit on this side of the House, Mr Speaker. And we know that they have reckless renewable energy targets. We know they have no plans for storage, no plans for the gas market, Mr Speaker. And we know that they are reluctant to get on board with the National Energy Guarantee because they didn't support it. And we also know that they are waging a war on coal and blue-collar workers, Mr Speaker. Now, Graham Richardson, a doyen of the Labor Party, said it right when he said Labor is playing games with people's lives when it comes to energy policy, and that the pensioners and the poor rely on a good energy policy for their heat and for their electricity, Mr Speaker. So millions of Australian retirees and pensioners could not depend on the Labor Party to protect their hard-earned savings, and they cannot rely on the Labor Party to introduce good energy policy. Only the Coalition will get your power bills down and ensure a more reliable energy system.
The member for Kingston.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why is the Prime Minister committed to a $65 billion handout for big business, but making our fantastic early childhood educators, like those in the public gallery today, pay more tax, with an early childhood educator on $45,000 paying $225 a year more tax?
The Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the honourable member for a question, and I want to say we all admire early childcare educators, and I want to say that, Mr Speaker, the government does not set the wages or conditions of childcare educators. The role of the government is to provide subsidies to hard-working Australian families so they can afford the care they need in order to balance their work and family responsibilities. And we are. As of the 2nd of July this year, will provide up to 85% of the cost of care for low-income families and record levels of investment. In fact, Mr Speaker, the increase in the overall subsidy for childcare is well over $1 billion a year. It'll be $8.8 billion in the first full year. Now, childcare reforms provide the highest rate of subsidy, 85% to those with the lowest incomes, below around $65,000 a year, provides the most hours of subsidised care to those who work the most hours, 100 hours a fortnight, removes the annual childcare rebate cap to families on less than around $185,000 a year, and that's 85% of families using childcare. And the Labor Party voted against it. They voted against that reform. And, Mr Speaker, we note the decision of the Fair Work Commission. It is an independent umpire set up by the Labor Party, and it determines these matters independently of government. We respect the independent decisions of the Fair Work Commission, and it's about time the Leader of the Opposition did too.
The member for Fadden.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Veterans Affairs and the Minister assisting the Prime Minister for the centenary of ANZAC. Will the Minister update the House on the establishment of that great project, the Sir John Monash Centre in France, and other activities that the government is undertaking to recognise the sacrifice of Australian servicemen and women?
The Minister for Veterans Affairs.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Fadden for his question. In particular, I thank the member for Fadden for his service to the Australian Army for the best part of 12 years. And I recall, Mr Speaker, in this place several years ago now, the former member for Bradfield and now the Australian War Memorial Director, Brendan Nelson, once saying something along the lines of, there's no greater service that a person can give to this nation than to put on the uniform of the Australian Navy, Army or Air Force and be prepared to place themselves in harm's way to help those who can't help themselves. And I think it reflected on the unique nature of their service to our country. And while this chamber can often be divided on other issues, this is one topic where I think we are very much united, particularly as 2018 marks the centenary and the culmination of the centenary of ANZAC commemorations. We honour those and we respect those brave servicemen and women who have served our nation and fought for our country with our allies 100 years ago. ANZAC Day does provide an opportunity for all Australians to reflect upon the service and the sacrifice of both past and current servicemen and women, and particularly those 102,000 souls who lost their lives in the service of our nation. Mr Speaker, it also marks the anniversary of the first major military action by Australian and New Zealand forces during the First World War. And there is a significant commemorative program currently underway which reflects the commitment from the government to acknowledge and commemorate the service and the sacrifice of all those men and women, whether it be in peacekeeping missions, whether it be in wars or conflicts for more than 100 years. Now, the member for Fadden asked me, Mr Speaker, about the Sir John Monash Centre, which is the most significant infrastructure project of the Australian government's ANZAC centenary program and provides a lasting international legacy for future generations. The official opening of that centre will be held on ANZAC Day Eve at Villers-Bretonneux in France this year. This is a state-of-the-art centre. It is designed to give visitors a unique understanding of the conditions endured by the Australian servicemen on the Western Front during the First World War. Now, Monash himself was quite an extraordinary Australian. Upon his return to Australia, he was required to form the State Electricity Commission of Victoria, which led to the development of the Latrobe Valley power stations and drove the economic development of the state for decades into the future. Now, just as we strive today to make sure that our modern-day veterans can transition into meaningful careers once they leave the Defence Force, with programs like the Prime Minister's Veterans Initiative and the awards ceremony which is on tonight, Sir John Monash certainly had an amazing career after he left the Army. So, Mr Speaker, when it comes to ANZAC Day commemorations, I simply encourage all members in this place, as I'm sure they will, to engage with veterans in their own communities, to attend their local ANZAC Day services across the nation. Each of these services, Mr Speaker, will include, no doubt, the immortal fourth stanza of the poem For the Fallen by Lawrence Binion. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them, lest we forget.
The Leader of the Opposition on indulgence.
On indulgence, the Opposition wishes to associate itself with the remarks of the Veterans Affairs Minister and notes that the Prime Minister will be attending the commemoration, and thank him for his invitation to the opposition to join him. And perhaps this House can consider at some point in the future whether or not it's now time for Sir John Monash, Australia's arguably greatest general, to receive recognition as Field Marshal.
The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.